feeling of it's a real tough job that small governments are given by EPA to regulate stormwater and erosion, sediment control, and all the tasks that they've assigned to us. So I've spent much of my career trying to figure out how to do it, and how to do it cheaper and faster, and so that we can get the environmental results that our citizens are looking for. And try to get away from the jargon and the acronym and the bureaucratic stuff that the folks in Washington and Annapolis do. But one of my jobs is I work for the Chesapeake Bay program, which is a partnership between the 6 Bay states and the District of Columbia and EPA to clean up the Chesapeake Bay and all the tributary streams and rivers to it. And I deal with the stormwater issues and try to guide the regulated community on how they can do it effectively.
I think it's working.
So just to kind of lay the stage for what Cecilia and I will be talking about throughout the entire day today, I just wanted to talk about some of the confusion that we have about BMPs, best management practices. Kind of give you in 2 or 3 slides the sort of recipe that we recommend for communities to meet this pollution diet. This is the name that we give to the total maximum daily load. Kind of give you a very quick summary of the approved BMPs at the Bay program. Just a couple of minutes on BMP verification, which is a new thing that communities will deal with. And some of the future panels that are in process, because when everyone figured this out about 4 years ago, they didn't really have a lot of information about what worked and what didn't work. And so part of my job is to work with the scientific community and assess which practices work, which ones are the most cost effective, and so we work and facilitate with a large group of expert panels. But in terms of the permits that you're dealing with, you're a long way from the Chesapeake Bay. I can testify to that because I drove from Baltimore up here yesterday, and it's a big watershed. It's sometimes very hard for you to make a big case about why the bay matters, but you have a lot of wonderful streams. I often tell that to my Pennsylvania audiences that, yeah, the bay is a long way away, but what you're doing is for your local streams and rivers, and you have some very high quality ones. In other states like Maryland, where I live, and urban Virginia, most of their water resources are pretty hammered by all the intense development and traffic. We have a lot of good ones, and the idea is how can we apply these practices in an effective combination to protect those streams, reservoirs, and lakes, and in some cases enhance them. So this is this level of BMP confusion. And this is really me when I think about all this stuff. And I just told you, I spent 30 years doing it. And there are days when I wake up and I go, I haven't figured this out. And so throughout today, if you have the same emotion, just raise your hand and ask a question, and we'll be happy to tell you what we know, and hopefully we can answer it. But we're really struggling to learn all about these BMPs. And there's a lot of reasons why we are struggling. This whole notion of the new MS4 permits and the Bay TMDL is only a few years old. There's a lot of technical details to master from a lot of different disciplines. The whole notion of figuring out how many nutrients you've removed or sediments you've removed, it's less than 4 years old. So professionally, we're in our infancy doing it. A lot of the rules haven't been fully fleshed out. We have these expert panel reports, and I didn't bring one, with about 150 pages, and none of you would have the time to read them. If you read them, you'd go, these are far too complex. We have developed, and I'm not sure whether they were a series of fact sheets that try to take the information in those reports and express it in 6 to 8 pages. What are the key details? And So I encourage you, if, as we go through this list of BMPs today, if there's some that you want to know more about, you might want to look at these.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a couple of each, so I'll pass them around.
And they'll be on the website for you to print off if you want more.
So basically, we all have this requirement to do in every state to figure out a way to remove a certain amount of nutrients. And the wonderful thing is the states never told us how to do that, and EPA as well. So this is what I say is the one of my favorite cooks, the compliance recipe. And a little tongue-in-cheek, but the first thing is you add 3 parts of stormwater retrofits. You chop up new stormwater practices and sprinkle them over new development. You add LID practices to seasoned redevelopment projects in your older communities. Add a few stream restoration projects, making sure to combine them with a few upland practices. Don't apply a lot of nutrients to your public land. Work with your private lands to have them do the same. And continuing a bit, combine everything together in a medium-sized subwatershed and let it simmer for a couple of years or until the practices are gradually implemented. That's a really key point. To do these practices takes a couple years to go from design to construction. So you want to skim off any gray nutrient discharges that float to the top, and sweep off any street crumbs with a vacuum sweeper, then season with a few other BMPs, and when you're done, hopefully DEP and EPA will let you know that. What's ready to eat. So the notion, in a kind of lighthearted example, is there's not just one BMP that we would use. We have to look at different kinds of BMPs. Retrofits are probably the primary one. And so in the fact sheets, we try to outline what they mean and how to local governments could use them, and to compile at the end of the fact sheets all the resources that have been developed. So stormwater retrofits are just a way of capturing runoff that was untreated somewhere in the landscape, storing it, allowing it to filter, infiltrate into the ground. Most communities, and this is not a hard and fast rule, but most communities, to meet their pollutant reductions, will probably have to invest about half of their effort in retrofits. It's kind of the big way of treating stormwater that we know now. It requires some investigation of the inventory of older stormwater practices in your community. And as we were driving up, I always say, this isn't really new. We've been managing stormwater for decades and decades and decades. We weren't all that great at it 40 or 50 years ago. But in the last 5, 10, 15 years, we have a fair amount of detention and retention practices in the landscape. So we need to kind of investigate what we built in the past, on private land and or public land, and look at those as candidate projects for retrofits. You probably don't have hundreds of them, but you probably have several dozen out there in your townships and whatnot. So just like a lot of things, you have a lot of them, not all of them are cost effective, so you have to usually work with an engineering consultant to assess that inventory of older practices, and retrofitting the old legacy ponds is probably the most cost effective. The reason why it's the most cost effective is somebody's already dug the hole for you. You just have to figure out how to enhance it so that it removes more sediment and nutrients. But the other reason why retrofits are a good community investment is that they provide a lot of benefits to your citizens in terms of reducing stream bank erosion, protecting stream health, fixing old drainage problems, protecting local infrastructure from further damage. A lot of the other benefits are laid out. They also help you meet if you have local TMDLs for things like bacteria or metals or whatever. They help take those out of stormwater runoff. In terms of that investigation process, we'll talk more about it in the, a little later this morning, but it's really an 8-step process where we kind of look at our entire watershed. We do a desktop analysis with maps and old records and as-built designs to kind of scout out in advance where the best candidates might be. Then we go out in the field with usually some engineering support and assess, again, the whole range of projects and pick the ones that work the best. We develop a retrofit inventory of the best projects. We evaluate and rank them. We do a little bit of modeling, and then we go for the projects that work, final design and construction, and then inspection and maintenance after they're done. So the entire process takes a year or two to go fully through. So you can't necessarily knock out a retrofit tomorrow morning. But there are what I call mini retrofits, and these are what we call residential stewardship projects. It's an allowable category of retrofits, and there's a fact sheet on those as well. This is just an example of a very high-class rain garden on my home, with all the wildlife it's been attracting. But one of the advantages of these is you already in your MS4 permit have a requirement for public education about stormwater and public involvement. So working with your residents, provide them financial incentives or technical assistance to construct these practices makes sense. And about 45 communities in the Bay watershed do this now, which is up from literally 0 5 years ago. And thousands are being constructed. In fact, they're now being expanded to small businesses and houses of faith to treat their stormwater runoff on their property and provide some nice habitat. So anyway, in terms of retrofits, if you are daunted by the retrofit scoping process that I showed you a minute ago, you might just want to start out with the homeowner BMPs. And I think that's an area in the design competition that you might want to look at. And one of the real leaders in the watershed has been the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay and their Riverwise program. So they've developed a lot of materials that you can steal, beg, and borrow and not have to reinvent the wheel. This is an example of how residential stewardship practices are applied to an individual house. Here is a half-acre lot, and you can see on the perimeter conservation landscaping so that the water doesn't run off, but it provides nice habitat for birds and hummingbirds and pollinators. We have rain gardens over each of the main leaders from the gutter system. And one of the great benefits of this is actually my house. My basement used to flood after every storm that was more than 1 inch of rain. So I designed a system of rain gardens, and my basement has been dry ever since. And so it's just an example of the co-benefits of doing it. Permeable pavement, tree planting, urban nutrient management, they're all things we can apply on our own property. I think one of the real shifts that we owe to be more sustainable is to encourage our residents to have that stewardship to make sure that their properties don't get
I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more what we mean by urban nutrient management.
Yeah, that's actually coming up in a
Okay, never mind.
But urban nutrient management is just real simple. When you go to the Lowe's and get your weed and feed fertilizer and apply it, it's not a problem to fertilize, but it's how much you fertilize that exposes you to risk. And when you look at your property, you can now, there's been an expert panel that's identified the factors that make it risky, that might run off from your lawn and go to a local stream, the water supply reservoir, or ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. And the advantage of this program and why I think it becomes so popular is nothing against engineers, but we often don't implement practices that are beautiful. And people love to garden, they love this time of year watching the new plants come up. And so these rain gardens and conservation landscapes can actually be very attractive, and we're selling the community a product that they may not know all the details about stormwater management or the Bay pollution diet, but they know that this is nice. And so they have built-in incentive. So the next part after retrofit, so the first thing is retrofits are a big part of what we need to do. The next part is how we handle new development and redevelopment. And there's an expert panel looked at that. You are already dealing with stormwater due to the Pennsylvania Stormwater Manual. An expert panel looked at that, and the new practices, they hold the line in terms of preventing an increase in your nutrient and sediment load, which is good. And that's saying a heck of a lot about what you're accomplishing now compared to a decade or 2 decades ago. So there's nothing, the other good news is if you are complying with the Pennsylvania Stormwater Manual, you don't have to compute anything. The state will do it on your behalf. You need to occasionally send them some data on how many BMPs or acres each year are being developed in your MS4 report, but that's pretty much all you have to do. So this is one of those BMPs that you never have to lose sleep about in terms of extra reporting. The biggest impact for you as a community, or an MS4, is that as time goes by, you're going to have more and more BMPs added to your inventory of stormwater practices. Now, many of them will be located on private land, not many will be on public land, but under your MS4 permit, you're responsible to make sure that they're functioning. And I mentioned, I teased you a little bit with the term verification. You're going to have to have some kind of system in place to report, track, and verify that your BMPs are still working over time. And that's a big change for a lot of communities. Now, you're going to have a couple of years to do that. And DEP has been very clear to the Bay program that it's a transitional issue, but just keep that in the back of your mind that you'll have to have some kind of tracking system so that you can maintain and inspect or enforce the inspection and maintenance of these practices. The way the expert panel worked is there's 2 kinds of stormwater practices: runoff reduction practices and stormwater treatment practices. The stormwater treatment practices are some of the traditional practices that we've built in the past. These are the more low-impact development, the green roofs, the infiltration, the bioretention. These are a little bit more effective for what we're talking about because they not only remove pollutants, but they reduce the stormwater volume generated by the site, whereas the traditional practices really don't change the volume of stormwater after they go in and out of the practice. So the runoff reduction practices are, and so what the expert panel did is they created a series of curves that will indicate, depending on what kind of practice you have and how much you're capturing, what the specific removal percentage is. And you use the same curve for retrofits. This is why I'm showing it to you. For new development, all you have to report to the state is how many acres of runoff reduction or stormwater treatment you provided, and to the state's stormwater design criteria. Now, the one area where you can get ahead in terms of your pollutant reduction is when you apply stormwater practices to redevelopment projects. That's a great situation because they had not gotten the stormwater treatment historically. That's where you can get a credit for it. The individual projects are collectively fairly modest, but over a couple of decades, in many areas, it can be about 10% of all your nutrient and sediment load reduction requirements. So that's why it's important to emphasize to your plan review and stormwater staff, your contract engineers and others, that when we have redevelopment projects, even if it's a half acre or an acre or 2 acres, those are outstanding opportunities where you're just asking them to meet the existing state stormwater law, and by doing so, by these practices, you get a chance to get some meaningful pollutant reductions. And it's a great incentive as well in terms of, as you're going through your municipal budgeting practice, and maybe you are doing streetscaping, maybe you're putting in a new elementary school, maybe you're putting in, fixing out the public works yards. When you're doing those projects, by applying the runoff reduction or stormwater treatment practices to them, that also acts as a redevelopment project. So when your architects and designers are working out those new projects, we all know we don't have a lot of spare money, but when they're doing it, it's an ideal time to piggyback on that process to get some load reductions. The other practice that I think is a pretty good component of local response is stream restoration, and it's expensive, it's sophisticated, requires permitting, so it's not, again, something you can just jump into overnight, but most engineering firms now have a pretty good sense of how to do stream restoration. And again, it's the community benefits. You're getting nutrients and sediment out of the water, but you're fixing eyesores, you're protecting sewer lines and roads from stream bank erosion. So I think it's, even if it's just 1,000 feet here, or a couple thousand feet there, it's an excellent approach. And the basic way that it removes the pollutants is it prevents, by preventing the floodplain sediments from eroding, they're chock full of nutrients as well as sediment. And by keeping them in place, it has a good nutrient reduction benefit, but it also increases habitat for aquatic life, which is, of course, the marker of a healthy stream. Now, again, I advise you to be a little careful. Stream restoration is a highly regulated activity. You need permits. You have to demonstrate that you're going to actually improve the quality of the stream, and so you need to have a reputable contractor with prior experience. And so the expert panel came out with 3 protocols on how you compute the nutrient and sediment reduction. We won't talk about them today, but there again, there's a fact sheet just on stream restoration that shows how it's done. But very simply, the first is by preventing the sediments from eroding. There's a credit for that. There's a credit for connecting the stream to its floodplain, and also for creating habitat features that promote denitrification conditions. And this is one area where you can kind of talk smack to other states in the Bay watershed. There's been some great work in Pennsylvania on something called legacy sediment removal. Big Spring Run in Lancaster, Pennsylvania is probably the most notable project. But these kind of projects score exceptionally high in terms of nutrient and sediment reduction. And I believe on your field trip in June, you'll get a chance to look at many of these projects. And if you're not sure what legacy sediments are, it's a very simple story. What happened is we have been in this watershed for several hundred years. And for the first 100 years, we generally grew tobacco and we had water power. So that meant we would put mills and dams across the streams. And we had all this tobacco and crops and so forth that were highly erosive. So all that upland sediment eroded, and it would get trapped behind the dams and the streams. So it raised the floodplain. It literally, in many cases, the legacy sediments are 3, 6, even 10 feet deep in the floodplain. Just a testament to how sloppy our ancestors were when it came to managing the land. So now we have all this stormwater, and it's cutting through that. So the trick with legacy sediment removal is taking those sediments out and creating this kind of thread-like channel with multiple things. And what's fascinating, if you talk to stream people that love this stuff, we think of a stream as a one channel with some curves to it. But in pre-colonial days, this is what they really looked like. They were multiple channels. There was beaver dams, ponds, and so forth. So this is a very retentive thing. And when you do get a big storm, it's connected to the floodplain, as you can see in the other picture. So I guess the shorthand on this one is, when it comes to stream restoration, you don't have to become an expert yourself, but your consultants, if they know how to do legacy sediment removal, you should check that out, because not only does it get very high sediment nutrient reductions, the experience so far in Pennsylvania has been very positive. All right, we had talked about urban nutrient management. This time of year, we're all doing this to get that yard back together. There are 2 credits that are available to MS4s in the Bay watershed. The first is for fertilizer laws, and the other are for urban nutrient management plans. The state of Pennsylvania even is currently right before the legislature for the 6th year in a row to have a fertilizer law. There's actually some chance it might be passed this year. But despite the fact it has not been passed, you still get a credit, because other states, like New York to your north, Maryland to your south, Virginia, and even the District of Columbia passed laws, and so the industry had to respond, and so they have taken the phosphorus out of their fertilizer. So you get what we call the freeloader credit, you Delaware, West Virginia, where by doing nothing at all, you get about a 10% credit. I'll show you how that works in a minute. So the fertilizer law is one. The other is to actually, on a property, get people to apply fertilizer properly. And my only advice is, 5 or 10% of your community is what you own or control, and on that land, you're usually paying an employee or a contractor to maintain it. So if for those lands, you want to make sure all of those are covered by urban nutrient management plans. If you have GIS, you can map out what private lands are at the highest risk, and This is also, not many of us know all that much about how to do this, so as a locality, we need to find a good delivery partner like Penn State, Cooperative Extension, Soil Conservation Districts, Master Gardeners, and others, because they can, at very low cost, help feed people into the urban nutrient management pipeline. So here's your freeloader credit in Pennsylvania. The reduction is 460,000 pounds. And again, it's automatically due because of industry phase out. So you, in terms of your urban load, about 9% of it is automatically reduced by the action of other states. Yes, Cecilia?
So Tom, do the municipalities, localities in Pennsylvania get to take this credit, or does the state take the credit for them?
That's a great question. I think the next slide. No, go back. That's a great case of that rule that has not been completely figured out in a TMDL. But if I were an MS4, I'd remember that slide and say, okay, I'm already got 10% home because of this. In terms of my bait compliance plan and any local nutrient TMDL. But we're still, as I mentioned at the outset, all this bait pollution diet is only about 3 years old, and so all the mechanics of how locals report to the state reports to the EPA reports to the state reports back to you, are still getting figured out. In terms of the urban nutrient management plans, this is for properties that are fertilized. The expert panel came up with high-risk lawns and low-risk lawns. And if you obviously want to target the high-risk lawns, and you get correspondingly higher removal rates for having those plans, if you can't distinguish between the two, you can just go for the blended rate. What's nice about it is you get further phosphorus reduction, but you also get some nitrogen reduction, which can be very difficult to achieve. Yes, sir.
No, can you explain, how do you identify, or what's the criteria between high risk and low risk
Great.
for lawns?
It might be in the next
I
slide.
have one here. So when we passed out the fact sheet, we didn't have enough to everybody. Who asked the question? So here's one on urban nutrient management, and it goes through what the kind of qualifying criteria for those rates are. So describe the practice.
Yeah,
It's on U5.
it's on page 3 of the UNM fact sheet. But basically, to go over some of the factors, soils that have phosphorus saturated, as determined by soil tests. Newly established lawns are a very high risk. Steep slopes, more than 15%. Runoff goes downhill. High water table within 3 feet of the surface, greater chance of leaching. Over-irrigated lawns. I don't think many of your lawns in this part of the state are irrigated. Is that fair? Okay, so that would work. Ball fields, athletic fields that receive higher fertilized within 300 feet of a stream is a high risk. We're not in karst up here, right? That's a little further to our south.
No, we have karst.
Yeah, if you have a lot of karst and you're fertilizing on that, you know how leaky karst is, very high risk. In my watershed, and karst is something that's, it's like stripes on a zebra. You gotta, no karst, no karst, and so forth. So I would map out where it was and target.
I'm sorry, what's a karst?
Yeah.
Limestone.
Bless you. Yeah.
Bring it down, we're just lay people here.
No, I know.
Valley is
Exactly.
karst.
Yeah.
Limestone, caves, sinkholes.
Yeah, think about this. Wherever you have a lot of caves, you have a lot of limestone, and there are areas, unlike with other rocks, that water goes through, has sinkholes, and microfractures, and so the connection between what you do on the soil and what happens to your groundwater is immediate. Whereas if you have like granite or other bedrock, that, the transmission through that takes centuries. But in karst areas, it's very high risk. Okay, next slide. Oh, construction, you have in your MS4 permit requirement to have an erosion and sediment control program, which is not a big deal because the state already requires you to have those programs. The big issue with construction sites are sediment loading, as you might expect. It's the highest sediment loading of any land use in the bay, which is why we've had erosion and sediment control programs around for decades. There's an expert panel that looked at them, and they confirmed through research that the erosion and sediment control practices that you're operating do an outstanding job to keep sediment out of your streams and rivers, about 90%. But the thing about erosion and sediment control, you probably noticed this driving around, you still have muddy water leaving the construction site most of the time because there's such high concentrations to start with. But it's only, it's gone down from like 25 tons per acre to about 2 tons per acre. So that's really good. The bad news is that construction sites don't do a great deal to reduce nutrients, and so they don't have any removal efficiency. The reason for that is we apply a lot of fertilizers at construction sites to get the grass started. And it takes a month or two for the grass to get started, so during that period we're very vulnerable to the wash off of sediment, of nutrients. The other implications for you is there's no real impact on your budget, and you're already doing the inspections, or your contractors are, so there's no reporting requirements to the state beyond what you're already doing as part of the MS4 permit. I'm gonna skip this slide. Skip this slide too. We have a session today on nutrient discharges. So I won't steal Cecilia's thunder on that. But this is kind of a key thing to understand that we've never really trained on in our careers. But we call, gray infrastructure are the water lines, the sewer lines, and the storm drain lines in your community. They've been built over a period of decades by a lot of different people, and they can become a major source of nutrients and bacteria. This slide here shows a watershed that is about 10 square miles in size, where there were 65 of these discharges in this 10 square mile area. It's high for what we've seen, but not uncommon at all. And you have in your MS4 permit something called Illicit Discharge Detection and Elimination, or IDDE. And so an expert panel was formed to see if you could get any credit for working on this. And they said, yes, this is a serious source, and you can actually get a program credit. So just by changing how you do your IDDE program, and what you do now, you can get a chunk of your pollutant load reduction.
Which report references that, what you use that?
We haven't made the fact sheet for that yet,
Okay.
but the full report is available on our website, but I can send it also to Donna to make sure that it's on the website for this workshop.
Okay, thanks.
You can download it. But we'll go through it in detail.
Yeah, so that's the review of the options that have been developed so far. There's a series of other expert panels that will be completed in the next few months. One on street and storm drain cleaning. What we've tried to do at CSN, because it's our job to get these going, is we're trying to match things that you're already doing and say, okay, if you shift them a little bit, can you get credit for nutrient reduction? Because we don't want to create brand new things for you to do, but a lot of you do have street sweeping programs maybe not for all your streets, maybe not for all your storm drains, but for those areas where you do it, you can get credit. So that report will be done this summer. And there'll be a lot of different options available to get credit for. And the basic thing to preview the results is the more frequent you sweep, the higher reductions that you get, which makes sense. Because the problem is that darn rain. It cleans our streets for free every 3 or 4 days. So we have to beat the rainstorm. So if you sweep once a week or once a month, as opposed to once a year, you get much more credit. The other ones that we expect, floating treatment wetlands, which is basically, think of a chia pet in a wet pond. And they basically sit there and suck up nutrients, and that panel it's very close to being done. Disconnecting impervious areas, that panel's just started. You guys don't have, I guess you have lakes in terms of shoreline management. Urban tree canopy and tree planting should be done 2015, 2016. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of end on this point. It's something we call verification. The rules of the road on verification will be developed by DEP starting this summer and probably going on into the fall. But the basic concept is that when you implement a practice, it has a fixed duration for which you get credit. And then if you want to extend the credit, you have to have an inspection program to verify that the practice hasn't washed away or been filled in or removed. So this is just a quick sense of, for the different kinds of practices, how frequently do you need to go out and inspect them? So that is really just a quick review of the big picture. I'd be happy to take any questions that I may have run over.
Oh, no, you're fine.
We're right on time.
You're right on time, and Mike just got here, so we're good. We have time.
Any questions or thoughts or?
Tom, in that last section there, so when we're gonna have to verify to make sure, say we've done some repairing repair on 500 feet of bank, we go out and we verify 5 years later that we still have a buffer strip, we still have no erosion, we still get full credit for it at that point in time.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And Cecilia will be, both of us, I guess, will be talking about what we call the visual indicator approach. So I think the example we'll use is primarily for bioretention and for, I guess we have some on ponds as well. But basically going out, sending someone out in the field to say the riparian buffer that I planted has not been chewed down by beavers. Or the stream restoration project that I put in didn't wash away in a storm, or another one that the homeowner BMP that we put in, they got divorced and somebody changed the rain garden into a rose garden or something. And so that's really, in terms of the regulatory side, it's kind of new, but there's always been in your MS4 permit this maintenance condition of when a practice is built, that the owner has this maintenance responsibility. And what EPA is saying to the states is, now it's your job as an MS4, as if you need another job, to make sure that, to verify that the practices are still there.
But a visual survey would be enough, we're not talking about like a habitat survey or anything.
Correct. Yeah, and that was like the big challenge. It doesn't involve water quality monitoring, it doesn't involve, it's a little bit different for each practice, stream restoration versus stormwater management, but basically, and I'll confess there are a few practices for which the indicators have yet to be fully developed, but part of our job is to make sure those are developed.
Right, thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Of all that quick review of practices that I showed, which ones I think do you feel are more regionally appropriate for the communities in the Blair County area?
If nobody's gonna talk, I'll add my 2 cents in. With the work the Center for Watershed Protection has done, we found in the report when we surveyed all of the comprehensive plans and other things like that, we found that the most common practices were stream restoration, riparian buffers, and bioretention retrofits. So that seems to be what's recommended most in the Chesapeake Bay Pollution Reduction Plan and also in other documents that Blair County's put together already as a group and municipally.
Yeah, and that's a real good point. That center document is a good foundation to work from. I think the nice part about it is it says, I gave you 10 options. Right now, you can't be good at 10 things at once. So be good at 2, 3, or 4 things and get the experience and the skills. And then, maybe a year from now, you can say, okay, I'm going to make my IDE program and get that program credit. But you need to, I assume many of you have children. When they're first born, you have a lot of hopes for your children, right? You want them to grow up to be trustworthy, strong, helpful, not swear a lot, whatever. You have a lot of expectations. And then by the time they're in high school, you just hope that they graduate, go to college, and leave the house, right? And that's really fun. So the key point is to try to understand the BMPs, understand which ones will never apply to you, and you can just park in your mind, and then figure out the ones that you need to get good at, and work with partners and other folks to learn how to deliver them more effectively.
I mean, that's one of the reasons when we put together the agendas and the programming for the next training, we chose topics like riparian buffers and stream restoration as a whole day. We're going to do a whole day on it because that's kind of what's applicable to the area and what's in the plan. So why not